Alrighty, people, today we have some pretty breaking news, not necessarily relating to Nintendo, although this will affect Nintendo if the deal goes through. It looks like Sony might be in talks to buy Kadokawa, who is the parent company for From Software, acquire the recent developers of Mario & Luigi Brothership, as well as Spike Chunsoft, and a ton of anime and manga properties. Let's talk about it. Okay, so this story broke late last night, and I want to clarify here, it's not official yet. Sony has not announced this deal. Kadokawa has not announced this deal. They've actually declined to comment on this, but this is coming from Reuters here. Exclusive, Sony is in talks to buy media powerhouse behind Elden Ring. This was posted last night. A couple interesting things here. Kadokawa's share prices in Japan actually went up 23% after this news broke, so that's definitely a sign it is real. Sony already owns shares in Kadokawa and From Software, and as we've seen over the past couple of years, they've been growing their anime portfolio. I believe they acquired Funimation as well as Crunchyroll and maybe a couple other things. Sony's been not necessarily just focusing on games. They've been growing in a lot of other places, but for us, the major thing here is definitely From Software, the developers of Elden Ring and Bloodborne and Dark Souls. If they buy From Software, that is the biggest acquisition that Sony has ever done, I would say. Bigger than Bungie even, the Destiny developers. And it's something that I think a lot of people have talked about, right? Like, oh, should Sony buy From Software? I think a lot of people associate From Software games with PlayStation, especially because of Bloodborne and because of Demon's Souls on the PS3, even though Sony didn't publish that game in the West. This is something that people have been talking about for years, ever since the acquisition war started, and it looks like it might actually be happening. Once again, not official, but we could expect an announcement in the coming days or even weeks. So, reading from Reuters here, they say Sony is in talks to acquire Kadokawa, the Japanese media powerhouse behind the Elden Ring game, two sources familiar with the matter said, as the technology giant looks to add to its entertainment portfolio. The talks between the two sides are ongoing, and if successful, a deal could be signed in the coming weeks, the sources said. Kadokawa's shares closed up 23% at their daily limits. Its market capitalization was around $2.7 billion prior to the Reuters reports. Sony shares closed up 0.6%. I think PR wording is very important here. So Sony declined to comment on this. Kadokawa said it cannot comment. The fact that they said they cannot comment, the wording there implies to me that something is going on here. Sony declining to comment, that's standard PR speak, but Kadokawa saying they can't comment, to me, is pretty damning that this is probably real. And just to kind of catch you up here, if you're unfamiliar with Kadokawa, Kadokawa began as a publisher in 1945, but has expanded into games, anime, events, and figures with franchises such as Re:Zero, in which a teenage boy is summoned to a fantasy world, so an isekai. Re:Zero, pretty popular. They also have Delicious in Dungeon, that's a huge one this season. I think Kadokawa also has like Oshinoko and Durarara, so not like the megatons. And I think it's funny because people are saying like, oh, Sony's gonna have a monopoly on the anime industry, and I guess that's kind of true, but also I don't know if you can have a monopoly on that industry if you don't own Shueisha, who owns Shonen Jump, who owns One Piece, Dragon Ball, Naruto, Bleach, that kind of stuff, Demon Slayer, all that, right? Without owning those, I don't know if you could ever truly have a monopoly. Or even like Kodansha, who has Fairy Tail and Eden Zero and those kinds of things. But yeah, Delicious in Dungeon's huge this year. But yeah, Kadokawa definitely has some pretty major anime and manga under their belt. They also own Famitsu, I believe, and just a ton of other things. They are a huge media company who also happens to own a couple of game developers, and that's what I want to focus on today. So the major three, I would say, that we need to talk about are From Software, of course, the Dark Souls developers, and Elden Ring and Bloodborne and Sekiro, Armored Core as well. Also Acquire, who recently did Mario & Luigi Brothership in collaboration with Nintendo, as well as Spike Chunsoft, who, while they don't make exclusively Nintendo games, I think most people would look at Spike Chunsoft and think, well, they almost always make games, at least for Nintendo platforms, if not working with them in some sort of exclusive capacity. You know, I mean, Spike Chunsoft makes the Mystery Dungeon games. They're the ones who are responsible for Pokemon Mystery Dungeon, the sub-series, kind of sub-spinoff of Pokemon and the Mystery Dungeon games. So if this happens, I think it's safe to say we will probably never get another Pokemon Mystery Dungeon. Now, it's possible that wasn't going to happen anyway. It's been a while since we've had a new game in that series. But if this deal goes through, I would say that solidifies the idea that we would never get one again. Same thing with Mario & Luigi. If this goes through, I don't see why Sony would let Acquire, their own studio, make a Mario and Luigi game exclusively for the Switch or Switch 2. So if this goes through, that is two pretty major blows in terms of like smaller franchises, right? Mario and Luigi, Pokemon Mystery Dungeon, these aren't huge things, but it would be sad to see them get acquired because it would mean that they would never be able to work with Nintendo again, which, especially in the case of Acquire, is like, that's the dream, right? We go all this time without a new Mario and Luigi game, and just for them to get bought potentially and then not be able to work with Nintendo anymore, that would be really unfortunate. And it's also just the entire issue with acquisitions in general. I mean, we've seen this year, Sony has shut down several studios. A lot of the studios they've bought have kind of turned to garbage, you know, in recent years. I mean, Bungie was already headed that way, but it really does feel like Sony's involvement, or maybe even lack thereof, kind of running that ship, led to Bungie's recent downfall. Obviously, they shut down a London studio. Firewalk with Concord was a total disaster. They just shut down, they shut down Firewalk as well as Neon Koi, their mobile team. I think last year, or maybe earlier this year, they shut down the team that made Concrete Genie. So Sony has a pretty crazy history in the past year or two of shutting down teams. If this deal goes through and they're buying Kadokawa, and you assume they're buying it from Software, but also all of the anime and manga stuff, I wouldn't be surprised if Acquire would get shut down, or Spike Chunsoft even would get shut down. Spike Chunsoft obviously being a much bigger branch than Acquire is. Spike Chunsoft does a lot of other stuff. They did Operation Raincode, right? I believe they own the rights to Danganronpa, of course, AI the Somnium Files, Shiren the Wanderer, even the Summer Vacation series that we recently saw spinoffs with. I believe Spike Chunsoft owns those. They also just developed and released Sparking Zero. Of course, Bandai Namco published that, but if this gets bought, that's another thing too. If Kadokawa gets acquired by Sony, this is a huge blow to Bandai Namco, because recently From Software actually acquired the rights to Elden Ring back, so they own Elden Ring. From Software owns Elden Ring. Bandai Namco currently owns Dark Souls, so if this deal goes through, Sony want to own Dark Souls, but if Bandai Namco loses From Software, who releases their biggest games, as well as Spike Chunsoft, who just developed their biggest game, that's a pretty big blow to Bandai Namco, because without From Software, all Bandai Namco really has is licensed anime games, and Spike Chunsoft, I mean, they also did Jump Force, which, say what you will about it, Jump Force and Sparking Zero, those are probably the two biggest anime games to release in the past 10 years, to be honest. So if they're losing Spike Chunsoft and From Software, that's a huge, huge blow to Bandai Namco. And yeah, it is a big blow to Nintendo as well if we don't see more stuff like Raincode and Danganronpa and of course Mystery Dungeon coming over to the Switch. That would suck. Maybe Sony would acquire them and let them continue being independent, kind of doing their own thing. Maybe they would still see releases on the Switch. And I think that's where it kind of gets a little interesting here. Sony has been publishing games on the Switch. I just don't know to what extent they're willing to do that, right? If they buy this team and they keep Spike Chunsoft and acquire, maybe they let Spike Chunsoft become fully multiplat, right? Like maybe you would still get stuff like Raincode in the future, and that would continue existing on Switch 2 and on PS5 and PS6. But then Acquire, I doubt they would let them make an exclusive game for Nintendo. That'd be weird. And obviously Nintendo's not going to let Mario and Luigi go over to the PlayStation. So Acquire, probably null and void. Acquire, I don't think would ever really exist and continue developing games, or at the very least not with Nintendo. And Spike Chunsoft, I would hope, gets to kind of exist as their own entity and kind of keep releasing stuff on both platforms at the very least. And that brings us to From Software, which is certainly the biggest part of this deal for, gamers, right? Maybe all the anime and manga stuff is actually a bigger deal in Japan, but for us, you hear, oh, Sony might be acquiring From Software. That is an absolutely massive deal. From Software is probably the most critically acclaimed developer, right up there with Rockstar at this point. I mean, From Software has solidified itself as like the top dog developer, and they win constant Game of the Year awards. Of course, yesterday there was the whole debacle with Elden Ring, Shadows of the Erdtree being nominated for Game of the Year when it's an expansion, and it shouldn't be there, obviously. So From Software, absolute powerhouse. If Sony acquires that, I was saying this to my friend Tucker, it kind of feels like a course correction. For the past 4 years, Sony has been mucking about here, doing all this live service garbage that no one wants. Obviously, Concord being one of the biggest stories of the year. This feels like a course correction of like, okay, we tried live service stuff for 4 years. It didn't work out. We're going to course correct and give the people exactly what they want, which is From Software single player games. That, I think at this point, From Software, like, people always say like, oh, Dark Souls isn't mainstream and stuff. Like, I think Elden Ring officially put that theory to rest. From Software is the mainstream game now, so Sony acquiring them, and then Sony potentially having the next Elden Ring as an exclusive, or the next new IP from Software as an exclusive on PlayStation, and maybe it launches day and date on PC. There's really no other studio that would potentially even make sense for them to acquire that would be anywhere near this big of a deal. Even Bungie felt like a weird one, but once again, they acquired Bungie because they wanted their expertise, so to speak, when it came to live service games. If they acquire From Software, they are doing it because they know we're not going to mess with you, probably. You're just going to keep making your incredible Game of the Year winning games, and we're going to let you do that, and Miyazaki's going to get his bag, and he's going to be able to keep doing that, and it's going to be incredible. But also, it sucks because if this does happen, you have to imagine Sony would not put From Software stuff on Xbox anymore. And even though the Switch is currently getting, MLB, obviously that's a little bit outside of their control because MLB require them to put it on Switch and Xbox. We're getting Lego Horizon Adventures. We're getting Freedom Wars. We'll probably get Death Stranding since that just came to Xbox. We'll probably get that on Switch too. I do wonder where the line is drawn, though. Would they draw the line at From Software stuff? Because that would be catastrophic. And I almost wonder, is that part of it? I've talked a lot on this channel about how people always view the competition between PlayStation and Xbox, and while that has been true for 2 decades now, the reality is when the Switch 2 releases and is more comparable to the PS5 in power and gets the same types of games like Monster Hunter and the current Resident Evils, right? Sony has to be a lot more worried about Nintendo than Xbox. They are definitely a bigger threat to them at this point in time, especially in Japan. I wonder if part of like the thinking with this deal is, well, we don't want From Software stuff releasing on the Switch. They make the biggest games now. Elden Ring sold 25 million copies. We don't want Elden Ring on Switch 2. We don't want Elden Ring 2 on Switch 2. We don't want Bloodborne on Switch 2. Well, obviously that won't happen because Bloodborne is a Sony IP. But you see what I'm saying? Like, I do wonder if this is like partially them kind of counteracting it and getting ahead of it, because the moment the Switch 2 releases and it starts getting these major AAA games that sell tens of millions of copies, when it gets Call of Duty, when it gets all the Capcom, AAA games, when it gets Ubisoft stuff, when it gets all these things that people buy a PlayStation for, more people, especially in Japan, will just start buying a Switch. You remove From Software from that equation, a lot of people will just actually still go to PlayStation, if that makes sense. So I do wonder if there's something to it there, but like I said, it is possible that maybe they don't view Nintendo that way, even though I totally think they should. Maybe they just give it to the Switch anyway. Maybe we still see Elden Ring come to Switch 2, which is funny because like we're all talking like, oh, the Switch 2 reveal trailer is probably going to have Elden Ring in it. And if that deal was made in place and if that game was coming, like even if we hear an announcement that From Software was acquired by Sony in the coming weeks, Elden Ring would probably still come to Switch 2 if it was in the cards, right? But moving forward, it won't. So that sucks, man. Acquisitions are not a good thing. I don't fear for From Software necessarily. I think they'll be fine. I think Sony will let them operate basically independently as they have been for the past 2 decades here. But I do worry for the smaller teams. I do lament the future of Mario and Luigi if this is true. I do lament Spike Chunsoft and the Mystery Dungeon games, as well as Danganronpa and stuff like that. But maybe Sony will just keep letting them do their thing. I don't know. It's not quite like it was 10 years ago. When you heard a studio was acquired, it's like, okay, well, that game's only going to come to that console. But now PlayStation publishes games on Switch. They obviously publish games on PC. Would this mean that From Software stuff would be day and date on PC? I would like to think so, but Sony definitely is. Even though they are releasing all of their games on PC after a couple months, maybe a year or so, they're still very open to PC. And I think we'll probably get to that point where Sony games all across the board do release on PC day and dates with the console version. This is definitely good news if you are waiting for Bloodborne, I think, though. I don't know what happened with Bloodborne. I do think there must be some sort of legal mumbo-jumbo there where, like, something happened with Bloodborne where they were not allowed to work on it without From Software. That is what I truly believe. I know Miyazaki has said he wants to do more Bloodborne stuff, but I just feel like we would have seen it by now. I mean, we're getting stuff like Horizon 1 remastered and Last of Us Part 1. Like, I feel like Bloodborne is the most requested remake at this point in time in the entire industry, frankly. So the fact that we haven't gotten Bloodborne is very weird, and I do feel like there must have been some sort of legal mumbo-jumbo there. But if this is true, if they are acquiring From Software and Kadokawa, you have to imagine we see Bloodborne remake, Bloodborne 2, Bloodborne on PC. Like, these things will happen if this deal does end up going through. But it is a crazy day if this ends up being true. I do lean towards it being real. I hope it's not, because I don't want to see Acquire and Spike Chunsoft die, and I don't really want to see From Software get tied down to more specific platforms, even if they would probably still basically get to exist in the same way that they do now. I do worry for Bandai Namco without this, because without this, they don't have much in terms of, multi-million sellers, except for their Dragon Ball and maybe Naruto games. But it's crazy news. I would like to hear what you guys think down in the comments below. I wanted to cover it, even though it is not necessarily Nintendo news. It is potentially something that could impact them pretty greatly moving forward. I would like to hear what you guys think in the comments down below. Of course, subscribe here for more Nintendo Switch speculations, theories, discussions, all that fun stuff. Follow me on Twitter @BotoxGames. And until next time, folks, peace.